There are certain roads in this country that simply do not belong to the living. They are forgotten arteries of asphalt, bleeding across the absolute middle of nowhere. Places where the radio signal slowly chokes and dies, where the cell phone service vanishes into a permanent no signal, and where the only proof that you still exist in the physical world is the vibrations of your own car engine beneath your feet. 2 years ago, my best friend Dave and I found ourselves swallowed whole by one of those roads. It was mid-July. We were on a cross-country road trip, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating concrete heat of the city and the crushing weight of our dead-end jobs. We wanted freedom. What we got was something else entirely. By the time we crossed the Nevada state line, the daytime temperature was hovering mercilessly around 110 degrees. The air conditioning in my beat-up, rust-spotted 2010 Honda Civic was a joke. It barely functioned, spitting out nothing but weak, lukewarm air that smelled strongly of old dust and melted plastic. Driving during the day had become a physical torture, so we made a decision, a seemingly logical decision, that I will deeply, profoundly regret for the rest of my natural life. We decided to sleep during the blistering daylight hours in cheap roadside motels and do all of our driving in the dead, silent hours of the night. We hit Route 47 at exactly 3:30 a.m. If you have never driven through the deep, untamed desert at 3:30 inches the morning, you cannot possibly understand the true nature of darkness. Out there, darkness isn't just an absence of light. It is a physical entity. It has weight. It presses heavily against the glass of the car windows, trying to find a way inside. The headlights of my Civic were old and clouded. They only managed to punch a meager, pathetic hole through the ink-black night, illuminating maybe 50, maybe 60 feet of cracked, gray asphalt ahead of us. Beyond that cone of yellow light was nothing but an endless, terrifying void, sensory deprivation at its finest. For the first hour, it was deceptively peaceful. Dave was in the passenger seat, the seat tilted back. His head was resting against the cool glass of the window, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of half-sleep. The only sounds in the world were the hypnotic, rhythmic thumping of the tires over the pavement and the low, comforting hum of the engine. I remember staring out at the empty road, feeling a strange, overwhelming sense of isolation. It felt like a post-apocalyptic movie. Like Dave and I were the absolute last two human beings left on the face of the earth. I should have been grateful for that feeling. I should have prayed that it was true, because the reality was far, far worse. We were not alone. Around 4:45 a.m., the geography began to shift. The flat, featureless desert slowly gave way to jagged, towering rock formations that blocked out the stars. Skeletal, dead Joshua trees lined the sides of the highway. In the extreme periphery of my headlights, their twisted branches looked exactly like long, desperate hands reaching out toward the car. My eyelids were getting incredibly heavy. The road hypnosis was setting in. I reached out toward the dashboard, my fingers blindly searching for the dial to turn up the volume on my Spotify playlist, desperately hoping that some loud music would jolt my brain back to reality. But just as my fingers brushed the cold plastic of the dial, something moved. It was a white blur. It darted out from the deep, impenetrable brush on the left side of the highway. It was fast. Incredibly, impossibly fast. So fast that a rational, functioning mind would immediately dismiss it as an animal, a coyote chasing prey, a large owl swooping low. But the human brain is a remarkable machine. It is hardwired, through millions of years of evolution, to instantly recognize human shapes, even in the dark, even in a fraction of a second. And my brain was screaming at me. In a microsecond, the figure was fully illuminated by the high beams. Time seemed to stop entirely. The world ground to an agonizing, terrifying halt. It was a woman. She was impossibly tall. Her limbs were unnaturally elongated, stretched out like taffy, and, terrifyingly, bone-scrapingly thin. She was wearing a tattered, flowing white dress. It looked like an old institutional hospital gown, but it was heavily stained with massive, dark, crusty patches that I knew, instinctively, were dried blood. But it was her face. Dear God, it is her face that is permanently, violently burned into my retinas. Her skin was the horrifying color of old, wet chalk. It was completely devoid of any blood, any warmth, any life. Her hair was a matted, tangled, filthy mess of black wire, whipping violently across her face in the desert wind. And her eyes, they weren't just dark, they weren't just black. They were empty sockets, infinite, pitch-black voids that seemed to suck the very light out of the air around her. Her jaw hung slack, unhinged, at an impossible angle. Her mouth was torn open in a grotesque, horrific Glasgow smile. Ripped, physically ripped, all the way up to her earlobes. The dead flesh around her lips was necrotic, turning a sickening shade of black, pulling back tight to reveal jagged, yellowed teeth that looked more like shattered pieces of glass than human bone. And she wasn't running. Her feet were not touching the ground. She was gliding, floating smoothly, effortlessly, just a few inches above the rough asphalt directly into the path of my car. I had slammed on the brakes with every ounce of strength in my body, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud against the front hood of the Civic. It wasn't the light, metallic crunch of hitting a deer or a dog. It was a heavy, dense, incredibly solid impact. It sent a massive shockwave straight up the steering column, vibrating violently through my hands and into my chest. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. My ears were literally ringing. Dave was instantly awake. He had been thrown forward against the seatbelt and violently slammed back into the seat. His breathing was shallow, erratic, and terrified. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was bathed in the pale, sickly green glow of the dashboard instrument panel. He looked completely drained of blood. "Man," he whispered, his voice shaking so badly it barely registered. "What did you hit? What the hell? What the hell did you just hit?" I couldn't speak. I tried to open my mouth, but my throat was entirely paralyzed. I was trembling so violently that my hands were vibrating off the steering wheel. I could actually hear my own teeth clicking together in my skull. I swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. "Did you see her?" I finally choked out. Dave stared at me. His pupils were dilated so wide his eyes looked completely black. He swallowed, a loud, dry sound in the quiet car. The woman, her face. Oh my God, her face. We sat there in the idling car for what felt like 100 years. Logic, reason, and basic human decency dictated that we should open the doors. We should get out, grab the flashlight, check the damage to the bumper, and see if there was a body on the road. We should call the police. But every single survival instinct I possessed, every ancient primal fiber of my DNA was screaming at me. It was screaming to lock the doors, put the car in gear, and drive until the gas tank was empty. I slowly reached down. My hand was shaking so badly I missed the gear shift twice. Finally, I grabbed it, slammed it into drive, and stomped my foot down hard on the accelerator. We didn't want to know what was trapped under the wheels. We just wanted to live. We sped away into the dark. The engine was roaring in absolute protest as I pushed the speedometer needle aggressively past 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. The steering wheel shook in my hands. I wanted to put as much physical distance between us and that exact geographic coordinate as humanly possible. But almost immediately, the atmosphere inside the cabin began to change. The lukewarm, dusty breeze sputtering out from the broken air conditioning vents instantly plummeted. The temperature dropped 20-30 degrees in a matter of seconds. It was freezing, literally freezing. I exhaled, and I saw my own breath billow out in front of my face in a thick, white, icy cloud. A heavy, oppressive, suffocating presence settled heavily onto the back seat. It felt exactly like stepping into an industrial meat freezer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up like needles. A terrible, sinking, utterly hopeless realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. We hadn't left her behind. Dave was completely losing his mind. He was frantically looking out his passenger window, both of his hands pressed flat against the freezing glass. "She's not there! She's not there! She's not there! She's not there!" He kept whispering to himself, over and over, rocking back and forth like a mental patient repeating a desperate mantra. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I forced my eyes to look up at the rearview mirror. My heart stopped beating. Completely stopped. Through the faint, blood-red glow of the taillights, I saw her. She was outside the car. She was following us. Despite the fact that my foot was pinned to the floorboards and the car was hurling down the desolate highway at nearly 100 miles an hour, the terrifying woman in the bloody white dress was effortlessly keeping pace. She was hovering vertically, just inches off the speeding asphalt. Her unnaturally long limbs were completely still. She wasn't running. She wasn't flying. She was simply being pulled along through the air by some massive, invisible, demonic force. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and her hollow, pitch-black voids where eyes should be were locked directly onto mine through the rearview mirror. "Dave," I whispered. My voice cracked into a pathetic squeak. He slowly looked back over his shoulder. He stared through the rear windshield and let out a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a scream. It was a pathetic, whimpering noise of a soul that has completely given up hope. Suddenly, the tense silence in the car was shattered. The radio, which had been off, violently erupted into a wall of aggressive, deafening static. I panicked. I violently smashed my fist against the dashboard, trying to hit the power button, trying to turn the volume knob down. But the dials were completely unresponsive. The static grew louder, hurting my eardrums. And then, through the chaotic white noise, a voice began to break through. It didn't sound like a radio broadcast. It sounded like it was coming from inside the dashboard. It sounded wet. It sounded like the speaker was underwater, gurgling and deeply distorted, layered with thick, wet, suffocating coughs. "Give us a ride." The freezing air inside the car grew even colder. I could hear the faint crackle of frost physically forming on the inside edges of the windshield. And then the sound started. From the pitch-black darkness outside the speeding car, a chorus of giggles erupted. It was high-pitched, childish, entirely unnatural laughter. It overlapped itself. It echoed. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. I frantically checked my left side mirror. It wasn't just her anymore. To the left of my car, floating perfectly parallel to my driver's side window at 100 miles an hour, was a teenage boy. He was wearing a bloody varsity jacket, but his head, the entire left side of his skull, was completely crushed. It was caved in so deeply, it looked like a deflated football, as if he had been struck by a massive blunt force. Thick, black, viscous blood trailed upward from his horrific wounds, defying gravity, evaporating into the night wind. On Dave's side of the car, two more nightmarish figures appeared from the ether, a grown man and a young child. The man was missing his left arm entirely at the shoulder. The stump was a jagged, horrific mess of exposed bone and shredded muscle. The young child next to him, Her legs were twisted backward at impossible, sickening angles. They were all floating, keeping perfect, effortless pace with the speeding car, and their dead, empty, soulless eyes were all fixed entirely on us. And they were grinning. Every single one of them wore that exact same horrific, torn, ear-to-ear Glasgow grin. I was officially losing my mind. My brain could no longer process the reality I was experiencing. I pressed the accelerator pedal so hard against the floorboard I thought I would break my ankle. The needle buried itself past 110, vibrating violently. The entire car began to shake, threatening to rattle itself to pieces. Suddenly, a massive, unseen force slammed violently into the passenger side door. The entire car jerked hard to the left. The two right wheels physically lifted off the pavement for a terrifying second. "Pray!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, wrestling violently with the steering wheel to keep the car from flipping over into the desert. "Dave, pray right now! Pray!" Dave collapsed into himself. He began sobbing hysterically, loudly reciting the Lord's Prayer, stumbling blindly over the words, his voice cracking and breaking as the car violently swerved back and forth across the lane lines. The laughing outside the windows grew louder, louder, louder. It morphed from giggles into a deafening cacophony of shrieks and gurgling screams. The ghosts pressed themselves closer to the car. I could hear their dead, rotting faces smearing and squeaking against the outside glass of the windows. And then, just as suddenly, and just as violently as it had started, the car slammed heavily back down onto all four wheels. The suffocating, freezing temperature vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the normal, stale warmth of the summer night. The demonic radio static abruptly snapped off, and my Spotify playlist quietly resumed playing its indie rock song. I looked left. I looked right. I looked in the rearview mirror. The figures were gone. The laughter was gone. There was nothing outside the windows but the empty black desert, the rocky hills, and the endless ribbon of highway stretching out ahead of us. I let off the gas. My legs were shaking so badly, I could barely press the brake. I slowly pulled the car over onto the dirt shoulder, put it in park, and collapsed over the steering wheel, panting heavily, gasping for air like a drowning man who had just broken the surface. Beside me, Dave didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just slowly, mechanically, raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at the windshield. I slowly lifted my head and looked up. There, illuminated by the faint ambient glow of the dashboard, smeared across the outside of the glass in a thick, dark, wet substance that looked exactly like coagulated blood, were 5 words. "We will meet again." We did not stop driving. We didn't pull over to wipe the glass. We didn't speak a single word to each other. We just drove, staring straight ahead, until the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the desert in a safe, warm, beautiful orange glow. Around 6:30 inches the morning, like a beacon of absolute salvation, we saw the beautiful, flickering neon sign of an old, run-down gas station. We pulled into the lot, parked the car directly under the brightest fluorescent canopy light we could find, and practically fell out of the vehicle. The gas station attendant was an older man. He had deep wrinkles carved into his face from decades in the desert sun, and a faded name tag stitched to his uniform that read, Earl. Earl took one single look at us, 2 college kids, deathly pale, violently shaking, covered head to toe in a layer of cold, terrified sweat, and he didn't ask if we were buying gas. He just reached under the counter, pulled out 2 ceramic mugs, and poured us both a cup of pitch-black, scalding hot coffee. We were so broken, so profoundly terrified, that the dam just burst. We started talking. We talked over each other. We told him absolutely everything. The woman in the white dress. The terrifying crash that left no dent. The freezing cold. The pursuit. The mangled, broken family hovering at 100 miles an hour. We fully expected him to pick up the phone and call the police. We expected him to call us crazy, to tell us we had fallen asleep at the wheel and shared a collective hallucination. But Earl didn't laugh. He didn't reach for the phone. He just sighed, a deep, heavy, exhausted sigh. His expression turned incredibly grim. "You boys," Earl began, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely too serious. "You boys drove through the stretch of highway we call the Devil's Wash. Mile marker 112. Am I right?" Dave and I just stared at him. We nodded mutely. Earl turned his head and looked out the dirty plate glass window, staring out toward the shimmering heat waves rising off the morning highway. 10 years ago," Earl continued softly, 10 years ago, this very week, a family was taking a summer road trip, heading down to the California coast. 5 of them packed into a silver minivan, a father, a mother, 2 teenage boys, and a little girl no older than 6. Around 4 a.m., a commercial semi-truck driver fell completely asleep at the wheel of his rig. He drifted, crossed the median at 80 miles an hour. He hit the minivan head-on. Earl paused, closing his eyes as if he could see the wreckage. The impact was so utterly violent, the state troopers said the minivan was barely recognizable as an automobile. It looked like a crushed soda can. They all died, instantly, torn apart in the dark before they even knew what hit them. Earl leaned his heavy elbows across the counter, locking his tired eyes directly with mine. Now, most folks think that when you die, the soul just floats on up, moves on to whatever comes next, heaven, hell, the great beyond. But that ain't always true. I've lived out here a long time. When death comes that violently, that suddenly, when the body is obliterated, in a fraction of a second, the soul doesn't even realize it's been ripped from the flesh. He grabbed a rag and started wiping the counter again, a nervous tick. The extended family, they held funerals back east. They brought priests out here to bless the wreckage site. But out here in the deep desert, the highway is a jealous thing. It keeps what it kills. Especially when a whole family gets taken together like that, they get bound to the asphalt. Earl poured himself a half cup of coffee, staring down into the dark liquid like it held answers. They are trapped out there in the dark, stuck in a loop. Some folks around here say they don't even know they're dead. They're just confused, wandering the road. Others say they know exactly what they are. And they are just furious. They want the living, breathing people who pass through their territory to feel the absolute agony they felt in those final, terrifying seconds. Or maybe... Earl looked back up at us, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting pity. Maybe they're just lonely. Mangled souls looking for a ride to a destination they are never, ever going to reach. We sat there in the brightly lit gas station, in complete silence, the gravity of his words slowly sinking into our bones. What we saw out there on Route 47 weren't hallucinations caused by sleep deprivation. They weren't a trick of the moonlight. They were the violent, residual echoes of an unspeakable tragedy. A family's final moments of terror, permanently etched into the very fabric of the desert highway. Dave and I survived that night. We waited until high noon to leave the gas station, and we drove the rest of the way to the coast in complete silence. But the memory of that night, it didn't stay out there on the highway. It followed us home. It has been 2 years. I sold the Honda Civic. I moved to a city where I don't need a car. I refuse to drive. And I absolutely, under any circumstances, refuse to be in a vehicle after the sun goes down. Because the trauma never really leaves you. Even now, sitting in my apartment, every single time I happen to look into a dark mirror or a dark window reflecting the room behind me, my heart stops. Because I am always expecting to see her. standing right behind me, hovering off the ground, with those empty black eyes, smiling her horrific smile, and waiting for a ride. People often say the darkness in remote countrysides is unlike the darkness in cities. In New York or London, the dark is torn apart by neon lights, car horns, and a never-sleeping rhythm of life. But in Ravensbrück, a poor town nestled among foggy valleys and endless wheat fields, the darkness is something thick, alive, and carrying secrets the living should never pry into. From generation to generation in Ravensbrück, the elders have whispered to the children strict local taboos. Do not look in a mirror by candlelight after midnight. Do not pick up rusted coins dropped at crossroads. And especially, an unwritten curse that every child in the area must know by heart. Never whistle after the sun goes down. My grandmother, Grandma Eleanor, a woman with cloudy eyes who had weathered many seasons of change, once stroked my hair with her rough hands and warned me in a deep, gravelly voice, "A whistle at night is a call to the underworld, child. The night is when boundaries blur, making way for the homeless and wandering to seek warmth. If you whistle, they will think you are calling them home, and whoever accidentally wakes the things that do not belong to this world must pay with their own soul." Back then, I was just a 12-year-old boy, raised in the dazzling city, used to superhero comics and sci-fi movies. Grandma Eleanor's words only lingered in my mind, like a fairy tale meant to scare children. Little did I know that some boundaries between the two worlds are so fragile that a single careless sound is enough to tear them apart. That summer, I was sent to Ravensbrück for a whole month. In this countryside, I quickly joined a group of local kids, Tommy, Arthur, and Sarah, freckled children whose hair smelled of sun and mud. That day, as usual, we grabbed our tin pails and headed to the dried-up creek near Blackwood Forest to catch frogs and collect quartz stones. Engrossed in wading through the water and flipping over submerged rocks, we didn't notice the sun setting. By the time everyone's pail was heavy, the last light of day had been swallowed by the dreary gray of the evening sky. It was twilight the moment the folks in Ravensbrück called the witching hour. We hurriedly packed our things and followed the dirt trail back home. This path was already deserted during the day, but at night it became even more daunting. It was the only trail connecting the valley to the edge of town, and across it we had to walk alongside the old Ashwood Cemetery, a vast, uneven plot of land dotted with cracked stone tombstones, broken crosses, and thick moss that obscured the names of the dead. Separating the path and the cemetery was an old, dark pine grove. It was completely dark. A waxing moon hung suspended in the sky, hazy and pale. A cold wind from the valley began to whip through the pine trees. The dry branches rubbed against each other, emitting a creaking sound, creak, creak, that sounded chilling, like bones grinding together, like someone groaning and crying in pain. A chilling air began to rise from the damp ground, bringing with it the musty smell of mud, the pungent scent of rotting leaves, and an indescribable, slightly burnt odor typical of a graveyard. My friends instinctively huddled close together, keeping their heads down and walking in absolute silence, not daring to utter a word. But I, with the arrogance of a city kid, found this silence suffocating and ridiculous. In a fit of excitement, I decided to break the stillness. I puckered my lips and began to whistle. The melody I whistled was a chorus from a pop song currently popular on the radio. The shrill sound rang out, tearing through the quiet, gloomy atmosphere of the dirt path. It echoed into the pine grove and out into Ashwood Cemetery, sounding out of place and eerily bizarre. Immediately, Tommy, who was walking right in front of me, stopped dead in his tracks. Arthur and Sarah slammed on the brakes too, nearly bumping noses into his back. Under the dim moonlight, I saw Tommy slowly turn his face. The boy's face was deathly pale. His eyes widened. His pupils dilated with absolute terror. He raised a mud-caked hand to cover my mouth, his voice trembling. "Hey, are you crazy? Don't whistle. Not tonight. You are not allowed to make that sound when passing through Ashwood." I swatted his hand away and sneered. In my mind, I just thought they were cowards. What's there to be so scared of? Ghosts aren't real. You guys are such chickens. Let me summon a ghost for you to see. With that, as if to challenge the night, I took a deep breath into my lungs and deliberately whistled a longer, higher note. The sharp whistle pierced the air, echoing clearly through the silent surroundings before sinking deep into the pitch-black cemetery. And that was the most horrifying mistake of my life. As soon as I finished the whistle, the atmosphere around me suddenly changed in a bizarre way. The wind abruptly stopped blowing. The pine trees stopped creaking. Even the hoots of the owls and the chirping of the crickets from earlier fell dead silent. It was as if every living creature around Ashwood Cemetery was holding its breath, waiting for something. The silence was so thick, I could clearly hear my own heartbeat thumping in my chest. Then, from the deep depths of the cemetery, behind the mossy boulders covered in tall grass, a sound emerged. Fweet, fweet. A whistle. It wasn't the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. It was clearly an answering whistle, but its tone did not resemble human breath. The whistle was dragged out, low-pitched, cold, and sharp, like an ice pick driving straight into my spine. The melody it whistled back was exactly the snippet of the song I had just whistled, but distorted and macabre. I flinched, my half-smile freezing on my lips. Cold sweat began to bead down my spine. I slowly turned to look at my friends. But they were no longer there. From the exact second the answering whistle rang out, Tommy, Arthur, and Sarah had dropped their tin pails and bolted, running for their lives toward the end of the road. They ran without daring to make a sound, vanishing around the bend in a flash, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the dirt path, flanked by a dark abyss of a field on one side and the Ashwood graveyard bathing in a grotesque moonlight on the other. My mind frantically clung to rationality. It must be some drunk guy hiding in the woods messing with me, I told myself, trying to swallow to soothe my dry throat. A boy's pride wouldn't allow me to run away. I aimed my mouth toward the cemetery and shakily blew a short whistle back, as if to challenge him. This time, the answering sound didn't echo from afar. Fweet. It sounded right by my left side, too close, only a few steps away from the pine grove. At the exact same moment, the temperature around me seemed to plummet. A freezing breath, cold like the air escaping a morgue, slowly caressed and blew directly onto the exposed nape of my neck. The hairs on my arms and legs stood on end. I smelled a putrid stench, the smell of damp earth mixed with rotting meat and decaying roots. It felt as though someone, or something, was hunching over, pressing its freezing lips right next to my ear to breathe. My body stiffened. My legs felt rooted to the spot. My survival instinct screamed in my brain. Run! Run now! And whatever you do, do not look back. I gritted my teeth, gathered every ounce of strength into my legs, and ran frantically toward the porch light of Grandma Eleanor's house at the far end of the road. I ran like I had never run before. The wind lashed at my face, tears and snot streaming down. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the darkness ahead, but the sounds trailing right behind my back. I could still hear it clearly, Mingled with the thumping of my feet on the dirt road was another set of footsteps. It wasn't the rhythmic running of a normal person. The sound of those footsteps was bizarre. Drag, scrape, drag, scrape. It was the sound of something incredibly heavy being dragged across the ground. As it dragged, it emitted loud scrape, scrape noises, as if long, sharp claws made of dry bone were clawing and digging into the gravel. That thing was chasing me. No matter how much I tried to speed up until my lungs burned like they were about to explode and my legs ached so much they almost gave out, that drag, scrape, sound maintained a constant distance. It was always right behind me, just an arm's reach away. Then, it started to whistle. The whistle was no longer clear, but frantic and disjointed, mixed with a guttural, raspy laugh that sounded like phlegm choking the throat of a drowned corpse. He. Fweet, come back here. Turn around and see who I am. A whispering voice in archaic English, slurred and sticky, sounded right at the back of my neck, accompanied by a blast of bone-chilling air. The back of my shirt was soaked. In a split second, my brain hypnotized by absolute terror, I was about to turn my head to see what disgusting thing was chasing me. But right then, the yellow glow of the porch light appeared through the canopy of the old oak tree. I saw Grandma Eleanor's hunched figure standing by the wooden gate, holding a hurricane lantern looking out. "Grandma, help me." "Grandma Eleanor!" I screamed, a blood-curdling cry that tore through the night. Seeing my silhouette stumbling forward like a ghost, Grandma Eleanor startled. She quickly threw the wooden gate wide open and stretched out her arms to catch me. The moment I dashed through the wooden fence and into the light of the porch, the freezing air behind my back abruptly vanished. The dragging, clawing sound on the ground died away. Everything returned to the normal stillness of a summer night. I collapsed onto the grass, dry heaving violently. I buried my face in her apron and sobbed hysterically, stammering out every word, every detail about the whistle, the footsteps, and the grotesque cold breath on my neck. After hearing my story, her face hardened. She didn't scold me. She shot up, hurried into the house, and brought out a jar of coarse sea salt and a bundle of smoldering sage. Grandma Eleanor muttered a passage from an old scripture, forcefully tossing the salt in a horizontal line right in front of the gate to create a barrier, then wafted the sage smoke around me. Once done, she pulled me inside, locked the heavy wooden doors tightly, and secured the latches carefully. Sitting by the roaring fire of the hearth, Grandma Eleanor hugged my trembling shoulders, her aged eyes peering through the curtains toward the pitch-black night outside Ashwood Cemetery. Her voice was a heavy whisper. "Thank the Lord. That little Tommy boy ran for his life and knocked on the door to warn me earlier, so I took the lantern out to the gate. And the luckiest thing of all is that you didn't look back. If you had just turned your head to look at it, even once, your soul would have been dragged down into the muck, and tomorrow your body would be nothing but an empty vessel floating in the Blackwood swamp." That night, I burned with a raging fever. In my delirium, under the flickering firelight of the hearth, Grandma Eleanor told me the truth about the thing that had chased me. Right at the edge of Ashwood Cemetery, next to the dark pine grove, was a nameless, unmarked grave. It happened during the Great Depression back in the 1930s. She clicked her tongue, rubbing my chest. "Back then, a drifter from another state wandered here. He was a petty thief, afflicted with a skin necrosis disease that made the joints of his fingers and toes fall off, leaving him with a dragging walk. Shunned by the people of Ravensbrook, he lingered in the old cemetery, eating scraps and catching rats to survive. On dark, hazy nights, he would often sit perched on an old pine branch, whistling sorrowful love songs. His whistling was mournful, sounding like the cries of a starved demon. Then, On one thick, foggy night, she continued in a low voice, an armed bank robbery gang passed through town to escape. They scattered to hide, agreeing to use a whistle as a signal. The drifter was lying in the graveyard, heard the whistle echoing, and thought it was a passerby, so he whistled back to beg for food. The robbers followed the whistle, thinking they had found their accomplice, only to come face to face with a diseased beggar. Afraid he would expose their location to the police, they ruthlessly hacked him to death with a pickaxe, then kicked his body into a half-dug grave and hastily covered it with dirt. He died a brutal, unjust death in the dark. Unable to move on, coupled with immense resentment, he turned into a demonic entity lurking in the Blackwood pine grove. For nearly a century, that evil spirit has held on to its hatred. It is extremely sensitive to whistling in the night. Anyone who carelessly whistles, it thinks they are the robbers from the past, or someone challenging it, it will call back. If that person is foolish enough to answer, it will follow their scent. Anyone faint-hearted enough to panic and turn around to look at it, their soul will be stolen to take its place. Hearing this, I got goosebumps all over my body. The fever made me groggy, but in my mind, the image of a rotting man, his fingers missing joints, with dragging, bloody footsteps, and lips pursed in a manic whistle, appeared vividly. The next day, my mother rushed from New York to Ravensbrück to take me to the neighboring town's hospital for IV fluids. That illness dragged on for a grueling week. Tommy and Arthur never dared to go near the creek late in the afternoon again. My family later asked the pastor at the local church to perform a cleansing ritual, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers along the Ashwood pine grove to appease the nameless entity. Since that summer, I have never returned to Ravensbrück for the holidays, and especially, I have never, whether intentionally or accidentally, whistled when night falls. Even when I grew up and became an adult, living amidst brightly lit skyscrapers in a bustling city. Because, deep down in my subconscious, I am still haunted. On nights when I stay up late working alone, whenever the wind drafts through the window crevice creating a small whistling sound, my hand unconsciously reaches up to rub the back of my neck. I am afraid. Afraid that if I let my guard down, one day, from some dark corner of my apartment, a sharp, cold whistle will ring out again. And with it, the bone-chilling sensation of someone pressing their rotting lips against the nape of my neck, waiting for me to turn around. The rain lashed against the massive glass windows of Sterling Manor, sounding like sharp nails clawing desperately at the night. Blackwood always welcomed its autumn storms with a bone-chilling cold, and tonight was no exception. Emily pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly as she looked out the window. The darkness outside was thick, swallowing even the faint, flickering streetlights in the distance. She was only 20, a college student desperate for tuition money, and the nannying gig at the Sterling estate felt like a godsend. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling paid handsomely. In return, she merely had to watch over their 8-month-old son, baby Leo, on weekends while they attended high society galas. "Emily, we've left the emergency contact numbers on the kitchen island." Eleanor's sharp yet elegant voice cut through her thoughts. She was draping an expensive fur coat over her shoulders, while Arthur stood by the door hurriedly checking his Rolex. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling. Leo is already fast asleep on the second floor. Please, enjoy your evening." Emily smiled, trying to mask the irrational anxiety bubbling up in her chest. "Thank you. The front door locks automatically. Don't open it for anyone. The forecast says the storm will be severe tonight," Mr. Sterling added before stepping out. The massive oak door slammed shut, leaving Emily stranded in the vast expanse of the ground floor. The silence hit immediately heavy and suffocating. This house was too big, Too many long hallways, too many unlit rooms, and way too many shadows lurking in the corners. Emily did a round on the ground floor, carefully checking every window latch. Once she was certain everything was secure, she brewed herself a cup of hot tea and sat down on the dark red velvet sofa in the living room. The ticking of the giant grandfather clock in the corner became the only echoing sound, counting down the seconds of what felt like an endless night. It was 11:15 p.m. The storm outside seemed to be growing fiercer. Thunder rumbled, shaking the window frames. Emily tried to focus on her psychology textbook, but the sheer size and silence of the house were gnawing at her nerves. Suddenly, a piercing sound tore through the silence. Ring, ring, ring. Emily jumped, spilling a few drops of hot tea onto the back of her hand. It was the ring of the old landline phone placed on the wooden shelf in the hallway. The caller ID screen flashed a ghostly sequence, 0000000000. She hesitated. Could it be Mr. or Mrs. Sterling calling to check in? Emily reached out, picked up the receiver, and pressed it to her ear. Hello? Sterling residence? Her voice trembled slightly. There was only silence on the other end. No, not quite silence. There was a faint static and breathing. A slow, heavy, raspy breath, as if someone had their mouth pressed right up against the mouthpiece. Hello? Who is this? Emily asked, frowning. A second passed, then two. Finally, a male voice spoke. It was hoarse, words drawn out slowly, sending immediate chills down her spine. Have you checked on the child? Emily? Emily's eyes widened in horror. He knew her name. The voice continued, slow, sinister, and laced with a sick amusement. He's so close to him. Don't you feel it? The cold creeping around the crib. Who the hell are you? How do you know this number? How do you know my name? Emily screamed into the phone, panic tears pricking her eyes. I'm calling the cops! I swear I'm calling the police! A soft, grating laugh, like metal scraping together, echoed from the other end before the line went dead. Beep, beep, beep. Emily dropped the receiver onto the floor. She couldn't take it. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket, her trembling fingers dialing 3 familiar numbers. 911. 911. What is your emergency? A calm, deep male voice answered, offering Emily a fragile glimmer of hope. Help me. I'm a nanny at 442 Elmwood Drive, the Sterling residence. Someone just called and threatened to kill the baby. He knows my name. Emily sobbed, her voice breaking with terror. Calm down, miss. I'm Officer Miller. Are all the doors locked? Yes, they're locked. But I'm terrified. He said he was close to the baby. Listen to me, Emily. Officer Miller's voice grew sharp and focused. We are dispatching a patrol car to your location right now. Due to the severe storm, it might take 10 to 15 minutes for them to arrive. In the meantime, stay on the line with me on your cell. If he calls the landline again, pick it up. Keep him talking so our tech team can trace the call. Understood? Trace the call? Yes, I understand. The next 10 minutes were pure torture. Emily sat huddled on the floor right next to the landline, clutching her cell phone to her ear. She could hear her own heartbeat syncing with the thunder outside. She kept glancing up at the ceiling, straining to hear any strange noises from the second floor. But there was nothing, only the wind howling through the cracks. And then, the landline shrieked again. Emily took a deep breath. Officer Miller, he's calling back. Answer it, Emily. We are tracing it now. Distract him. With a shaking hand, she picked up the receiver. Hello? The heavy breathing returned. It sounded clearer this time. Wetter. Do you know what color blood stains a white rug, Emily? Emily bit her lip hard to stop a sob from escaping. Why are you doing this? We've never done anything to you. Do you want money? Mister, Sterling has a safe. I'll give you the passcode. I don't want money. The cold voice interrupted. I just want to hear the despair in your voice when you realize you're too late. The child is sleeping so peacefully. It'd be a shame to wake him. No, don't you touch him, Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Over her cell phone, she could hear the frantic clicking of Officer Miller's keyboard. Hurry, please, she prayed silently. Are you crying, Emily? Don't cry. Come upstairs. Come up here and watch what I'm about to do. Suddenly, Officer Miller's voice erupted from her cell phone, but the calm professional tone was completely gone. It was replaced by sheer panic. Emily, hang up! Hang up the landline now! Emily flinched, dropping the landline receiver. Officer Miller, what's wrong? Did you find out where he is? The officer's voice trembled through the speaker. Emily, listen to me very carefully. You need to get out of that house immediately. Do not go upstairs. Do not hesitate. Open the front door and run straight out into the rain. The patrol car is 3 minutes away. But why? The baby. Emily, the tech team just got the ping. The call isn't coming from outside. It's coming from the internal line. That call. It's originating from the bedroom phone on the second floor. He's in the house with you! Emily's heart stopped. The blood in her veins turned to ice. He was inside. He hadn't been watching from the outside. He was hiding in the darkness of the second floor, right there with baby Leo. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to unlock the front door and flee into the safety of the night. But the image of Leo's innocent smile flashed across her mind. If she ran, the baby would die. I can't leave him, Emily whispered into the phone. Emily, don't be a fool. You don't have a weapon. You can't. She ended the call on her cell and slipped it into her pocket. The house was dead silent now. The light from the upstairs hallway cast grotesque, elongated shadows down the carpeted stairs. Emily took off her wool shoes so her footsteps wouldn't make a sound. She crept into the kitchen, her trembling hands pulling the longest, sharpest carving knife from the wooden block. The cold steel blade reflected a flash of lightning from outside. She took a deep breath and began to climb the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. Every step felt like an eternity. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to melt into the shadows. Reaching the landing, she looked down the long hallway. The door to Leo's room was ajar. The light from the moon-shaped nightlamp had been turned off. The room was submerged in a thick, suffocating darkness. Emily held her breath, gliding across the carpet like a ghost. As she neared the door, she heard it. A faint creak. The wooden floorboards groaning under a heavy weight. Someone was moving around the crib. She peered through the narrow crack of the door. In the dimness, illuminated by brief flashes of lightning, she saw a tall, gaunt silhouette. He wore a dark raincoat, leaning over the crib. In his hands, he held a glinting nylon cord, pulled taut. Pure, primal rage and the instinct to protect completely overpowered her fear. Emily kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall with a deafening crash. "Get away from him!" she shrieked, lunging at the dark figure with the knife raised high. The intruder spun around in shock. Under the flickering lightning, Emily caught a glimpse of a pale, expressionless mask. He hadn't expected her to come upstairs. In that split second of surprise, Emily's blade slashed deeply into his arm. He roared in agony, stumbling backward and tripping over the baby's rocking chair. Without missing a beat, Emily rushed to the crib, scooping baby Leo up into her arms. The infant woke up with a start and began wailing. The intruder regained his balance. his eyes burning with murderous intent as he pulled a small hunting dagger from his coat. Right at that exact moment. Wee woo, wee woo. Red and blue lights flashed wildly through the windows, painting the nursery in chaotic colors. The wail of police sirens tore through the stormy night. Loud, heavy banging echoed from the front door downstairs. "Police! Open the door!" The intruder froze. He knew his time was up. With a hateful glare at Emily, he bolted for the balcony, kicked open the glass door, and leaped onto the awning below, vanishing into the torrential rain and darkness. Emily collapsed to the floor, clutching Leo tightly to her chest, her entire body shaking as violent, relieved sobs racked her frame. When the police officers finally burst into the room with flashlights and drawn weapons, all they found was a brave nanny holding on to the most fragile of lives, surrounded by shattered glass and the lingering scent of terror. The next morning, the police locked down Sterling Manor. During their investigation, they discovered that the intruder had sneaked into the house early that afternoon. He had been hiding in the empty attic space directly above Leo's room. He had watched the family's every move through the air vents, splicing a secondary handset into the landline cable that ran across the ceiling. He was never outside in the storm. He had always been there, waiting, watching, feeding on the escalating terror of his prey. Emily had saved baby Leo, but she knew the static hum of that landline and the raspy whisper, "Have you checked on the child?" would haunt her nightmares forever. Because some monsters don't hide under your bed, and they don't lurk in the dark woods. Sometimes they are already inside your house, simply waiting for you to pick up the phone. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the Volvo, like bones snapping in the dead of night. David and Emily Carter had been driving for 6 hours, leaving the suffocating smog and relentless noise of the city far behind them. They were seeking a fresh start, a quiet sanctuary where David could finish his architectural blueprints and Emily could overcome the writer's block that had plagued her for 2 years. What they found, instead, was Blackwood Grange. The real estate agent had called it a vintage fixer-upper with historical charm, sitting at the end of a winding, unpaved road flanked by ancient skeletal pine trees. The house loomed against the twilight sky like a forgotten tombstone. It was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian monstrosity. Its paint was peeling like diseased skin, and the tall, narrow windows stared out into the dense forest like hollow, unblinking eyes. "It's bigger than the photos suggested," Emily whispered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The air outside the car was unseasonably cold for early autumn, carrying the damp, earthy scent of rotting leaves and something else, something metallic, like old copper. "It's perfect, Em," David said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He squeezed her hand, trying to inject warmth into the chilling atmosphere. "A few coats of paint, some landscaping, and it'll be our dream home. Total peace and quiet." But as they stepped onto the wooden porch, the floorboards groaned beneath their weight, a sound that was less like settling wood and more like a warning. The heavy oak front door swung open with a rusty shriek, revealing a cavernous hallway swallowed by shadows. The silence inside was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and expectant. It felt as though the house was holding its breath. Exhaustion forced them to leave most of the boxes in the living room. They dragged their mattress up the grand winding staircase to the master bedroom on the second floor. The room was massive, smelling faintly of mothballs and dried lavender, but no matter how high David turned up the radiator, a persistent, icy draft crawled along the floorboards. It was 2:14 a.m. when Emily first opened her eyes. The darkness in the room was absolute. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. What had woken her? She strained her ears, listening to the rhythmic breathing of her husband beside her. Then she heard it. Scrurch, scrurch, scrurch. It was coming from inside the wall, directly behind the headboard. It sounded like a set of long, jagged fingernails slowly dragging against the dry plaster. "David," Emily hissed, shaking his shoulder. "David, wake up." He stirred, groaning in protest. "What is it?" "Listen," she whispered, her voice trembling. They sat in the dark. For a long moment, there was only the wind howling outside. Then, the sound shifted. It was no longer a scratching. It was a dull, heavy thud. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was pacing in the attic directly above them. The steps were slow, deliberate, and incredibly heavy. "It's just raccoons, Em," David said, rubbing his eyes, though he sounded unconvinced. "Or old pipes settling. The house is over 100 years old. It's going to make noises." He threw off the covers, grabbed his flashlight, and walked out into the hallway. Emily sat paralyzed, clutching the blanket to her chin. She listened as David's footsteps faded down the hall, followed by the creak of the attic door. 10 agonizing minutes passed before he returned, shivering. "Nothing," he declared, climbing back into bed. "Empty. Just a bunch of dust and old cobwebs. I told you, it's just the wind playing tricks on us." But as Emily lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, she knew that no wind in the world wore heavy leather boots. By the second week, the rationalizations began to crumble. David's logic could no longer explain away the sheer impossibility of what was happening. Keys left on the kitchen counter would inexplicably vanish, only to be found perfectly aligned on the bathroom sink upstairs. Doors they had firmly locked at night would be found wide open in the morning, swaying gently in the frigid air. But the kitchen was where the true nightmare began to manifest. It was a Tuesday afternoon. David was upstairs in his makeshift office, and Emily was unpacking the last of the dishware. She turned to place a stack of plates into the upper cabinet, and when she turned back, every single drawer in the kitchen island had been pulled completely open. Emily froze. A sudden violent drop in temperature caused her breath to plume in the air like pale smoke. The hair on her arms stood up. Then came the smell. It didn't waver in gently. It hit her like a physical blow. It was the sickening, sweet stench of rotting meat, mixed with the sharp tang of rusted iron and dried blood. She gagged, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. "David!" she screamed, her voice cracking in terror. Before David could rush down the stairs, a heavy glass tumbler sitting on the counter violently launched itself across the room, smashing into 1,000 jagged pieces against the far wall. Emily collapsed to her knees, weeping hysterically, as the kitchen cabinet slammed shut in unison with a sound like a gunshot. When David found her, the smell had vanished, leaving only the scent of pine cleaner and fear. He held her shaking body, looking at the shattered glass. He couldn't blame it on the wind anymore. The house was not empty. They were sharing it with something deeply, violently angry. Desperation drove them to break their isolation. Emily invited her closest friend, Sarah, to the house. Sarah didn't even make it past the foyer. The moment she crossed the threshold, she became violently nauseous, her face draining of color. "There is something terribly wrong with this place, Emily," Sarah gasped, clutching her chest. "You need to leave. If you won't leave, you need to call someone who understands this. I know a man, Elias Thorne. He's a medium, a sensitive. Please, just call him." Elias Thorne arrived 2 days later. He was an older man, entirely blind, walking with a heavy wooden cane. But what he lacked in sight, he made up for in an eerie, unsettling awareness. As soon as he stepped onto the porch, he stopped, His milky white eyes darted back and forth as if watching invisible figures dart through the trees. "The soil here is sour," Elias murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. "It drinks pain." He didn't need David to guide him. He navigated the labyrinthine halls of Blackwood Grange with alarming precision, his fingers grazing the peeling wallpaper. He walked directly into the kitchen, paused, and then slowly made his way up the stairs to the master bedroom. He stood exactly over the spot where Emily heard the scratching on the first night. "There is an echo here," Elias said, leaning heavily on his cane. He began to tremble, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the freezing temperature of the room. A terrible, violent echo, a loop of suffering. "What do you mean?" David asked, his skepticism entirely replaced by a creeping dread. "A house is like a sponge," the blind medium explained, his breathing growing shallow. "It absorbs the emotions of the people who live in it, love, joy, sadness. But when something utterly horrific happens, the house cannot digest it. It traps the trauma in its walls. It replays it." Elias suddenly fell to his knees, clutching his head as if overwhelmed by a deafening noise. "No!" he screamed, terrifying Emily. "No, please, don't do it! The child! Spare the child!" David rushed forward to help the old man, but Elias violently pushed him away. "He's here," Elias sobbed, his face contorted in absolute horror. "The man with the hammer, the man with the empty eyes. He went mad. The isolation broke his mind. He trapped his wife in the kitchen, and he hunted his little boy up the stairs. He walled them up. He walled them up so they could never leave him." Elias scrambled backward, completely losing his composure. "You have to leave," he shouted, crawling toward the door. "He thinks you are them. He thinks you are the ones trying to escape. He is going to finish what he started. Leave this place tonight." Without waiting for his fee, the blind medium stumbled down the stairs and out the front door, fleeing into the woods as if the devil himself were snapping at his heels. Silence descended on the house once more, but it was a ringing, suffocating silence. David and Emily stood in the bedroom, pale and trembling. The rationalizations were dead and buried. "Pack a bag," David said, his voice deadly calm. "Just a small bag. Clothes, passports, wallets. We're leaving the furniture. We're leaving right now." Emily didn't argue. She threw open her suitcase and began indiscriminately shoving clothes inside. Panic made her clumsy. David ran down the hall to the guest room to grab his laptop. As Emily hurried to empty the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner of their bedroom, a sudden violent tremor shook the floor. It wasn't an earthquake. It was localized entirely within the room. The wardrobe, which weighed hundreds of pounds, shifted violently to the left, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Emily jumped back, a scream catching in her throat. Where the wardrobe had stood, the floorboards were severely warped, bowing upward as if something beneath them was pushing to get out. Driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, Emily knelt down. The wood was loose. With trembling fingers, she wedged her nails under the largest board and pulled. It popped loose with a sickening crack, releasing a puff of stagnant, foul-smelling dust. Inside the hidden cavity was a small, rusted metal lockbox. Her hands shaking uncontrollably, Emily pried the lid open. Inside lay a woman's silver locket, heavily tarnished and stained with something dark and crusty. Beneath the locket was an old, sepia-toned photograph, its edges curled and brittle. Emily picked it up, taking it to the pale light of the window. It was a family portrait. A woman with kind, sad eyes sat in a chair, holding a little boy who couldn't have been older than 5. Standing behind them, resting his hands heavily on the woman's shoulders, was a tall, imposing man. He wore a dark suit, his face stern and unsmiling. Emily's blood ran colder than ice. The man in the photograph. She recognized his eyes. She hadn't seen his face before, but she had felt his presence in the dark. She had felt his oppressive anger in the kitchen. She had heard his heavy boots in the attic. At the bottom of the photograph, scrawled in elegant fading ink, was a caption: Arthur, Margaret, and little Thomas Blackwood. November 1924, in our forever home. Suddenly, the air in the bedroom was sucked away. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost instantly bloomed across the window panes, obscuring the moonlight. From the hallway outside the open bedroom door, the heavy, rhythmic thud of leather boots began. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't coming from the attic anymore. It was coming up the main staircase. "David!" Emily shrieked, dropping the photograph. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. The eyes of Arthur Blackwood seemed to stare directly into her soul. David burst out of the guest room just as the heavy footsteps reached the top of the landing. "Run, Emily, run!" David roared. They didn't grab the suitcases. They didn't grab their coats. Emily sprinted into the hallway, grabbing David's hand. As they dashed toward the stairs, the house erupted into total chaos. The doors to every room began to slam open and shut with deafening violence. The wallpaper in the hallway began to peel and curl downward, as if the house itself was shedding its skin. From the darkness at the end of the hall, a shape began to manifest. It was a massive silhouette, towering and broad-shouldered, holding something long and heavy in its right hand. It wasn't a ghost of transparent mist. It was a shadow denser than night, radiating an ancient, murderous rage. The heavy dragging sound resumed, accompanied by the metallic scrape of a hammer dragging against the wooden walls. Emily and David threw themselves down the stairs, nearly breaking their ankles in the darkness. As they reached the foyer, the heavy oak front door slammed shut on its own, locking with a definitive, echoing click. "No, no, no!" David yelled, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his might. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been welded shut. Behind them, the slow, methodical footsteps began to descend the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. "The window!" Emily cried, pointing to the tall pane of glass in the dining room. David grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the living room hearth. With a scream of pure adrenaline, he swung it at the window. The antique glass shattered inward, raining crystalline shards over the dusty floor. Without hesitating, they scrambled through the broken frame, tearing their clothes and skin on the jagged edges. They fell into the overgrown bushes outside, scrambling to their feet in the freezing rain that had begun to fall. They ran. They didn't look back. They ran down the long, winding driveway, ignoring the pain in their bleeding hands and the burning in their lungs. They threw themselves into the Volvo. David fumbled wildly with his keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them twice onto the floorboard. Finally, the engine roared to life. He threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires in the wet gravel, and rocketed backward onto the main road. He slammed the gear into drive and hit the accelerator. As the car sped away into the safety of the night, Emily turned to look out the rear window. Blackwood Grange stood atop the hill, silhouetted against the stormy sky. In the second-floor window, their bedroom window, the frost had melted away. Standing there, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was the unmistakable figure of a tall man in a dark suit. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the window frame. And right beside him, pressing its pale, sorrowful face against the glass, was a little boy. They drove back to the city in complete silence. They abandoned their clothes, their furniture, and their savings. The bank foreclosed on Blackwood Grange a year later. It remains empty to this day, sitting at the end of the long dirt road, waiting patiently in the fog. Because some houses don't just hold memories. Some houses are traps built by the dead, forever waiting for the living to move in.